Right now, after being bullied for months, a 12-year-old girl in Florida jumps to her death. Now, 2 other teens are in court facing felony charges, and this is far from an isolated case. But what, if anything, can we do to stop this tragic trend? And what should parents be looking out for? Tonight, my special interview with Richard Guerry, one of the best anti-bullying specialists out there. And then, does anyone really think the solution to our political problems is more money into the system? And yet, here it comes. Will politicians still listen to the little guy, if they do now, when there's a billionaire standing in his way? Our panel weighs in on the new golden rule in politics. And later, a celebration nearly a full year in the making. The Long Beach Boardwalk reopens as the Sandy anniversary approaches, and we will take you there. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and thank you so much for joining us this Friday evening, October 25th. You know, on this program, we always talk about politics and policy, and there's an issue that kind of breaks with our normal format here, but it's an issue that I know is on the mind of every parent here, and it's an issue that we're all too reminded of in the news that it breaks our heart. It's the story that you could fit into the definition when you look under tragedy. A bullied preteen commits suicide after months of anguish, and the 2 young people believed responsible, they're now facing felonies charges of their own. Now, it is the story of 12-year-old Rebecca Sedgwick. She jumped to her death from a grain silo in Florida last month after a group of about 15 other girls tormented her for months on end. It was in part because Rebecca's ex-boyfriend began dating one of the other girls. Now, felony stalking charges have been filed against a 14-year-old and against another 12-year-old, both accused of bullying Rebecca to her death. Now, you don't have to look long or tragically hard here to find other examples of this, examples that have one commonality. They end in tragedy or sometimes, fortunately, near tragedy. An 11-year-old in Portland, Oregon, in juvenile court, after bringing an arsenal to school, a complete set of kitchen knives, 22 caliber handgun, 2 loaded ammo magazines, and 400 additional rounds all in his locker. His plan, you ask? To shoot another student, then shoot himself in the head. And get this, he wasn't even the one being bullied. This was his way of trying to help a friend who was being tormented at school. It's a problem that has left parents understandably scared, frustrated, and many throwing up their hands. It's also left schools and organizations looking to protect themselves as much as protecting the kids in their charge. And it's left some children turning to violence and self-defense. This is a student self-defense class in Idaho. And I ask you, is this the next step here for bullied kids? They got to teach them how to fight back. And the problem is everywhere you look, reaching more students than we ever imagined. A new poll that just came out today from the Associated Press and MTV, it found 46%, nearly half of all American teens and young adults, have dealt with electronic harassment. And even scarier, only 34% of them went to a parent. 18% went to a sibling. The rest may not have gone to anyone. Bullied teens say changing their email or phone numbers, it helps, and so does talking to a parent. But nearly a third of all bullied teens say retaliation, that's the way to go. Though the same number said retaliation, it's got no effect on the bullying problem. And 1 out of 5 say revenge actually makes things worse. So with that, we can agree. We share outrage over this, the tragedy, the heartbreaking details that emerge on too many of these kind of stories. But then, as always seems to be the case, there are more questions than answers. Not just what to do about it, who to hold accountable, but also how you at home can deal with a problem that sometimes seems so big here and so hard to get a handle on it. So we thought the best idea is to bring in somebody who knows a lot about this, and I can't think of a better guest than our next one, Richard Guerry. Richard is the founder and executive director of the Institute for Responsible Online and Cell Phone Communication. This after his earlier career as an interactive marketing director. He's also one of, as I said, of the clearest voices when it comes to bullying, cyberbullying, and how to fight it that I've heard here. And we did a special before a few years back. Yep. And I thought, especially in the case of the Rebecca Sedgwick tragedy, this would be a great time. And you speak to parents, you go out for dinner, and even if they're not dealing with it, in the back of every parent's mind, they say, well, what would I do if this happens? How would I even know before, God forbid, it's too late? So, Richard, we've got the face of the tragedy, the latest one, I should say, this poor 12-year-old girl. But give an idea to the scope of it, because people see the sensationalized cases, but there's so many that are happening every day.
That's right. It's devastating, to be honest with you, especially as a parent. I mean, you put yourself in the position of a parent, and I try and keep a very focused mindset on being a professional, but as a parent, you know, it's a lot more terrifying. And really what it comes down to is, we hear about, to your point, the sensationalized cases when something is traumatic. But every day, whether it be inside of a gaming system, social media, texts, email, it's almost like those conversations you might have, and just think about growing up, that you might have about somebody behind closed doors, and think about how frequently that might have happened. It's now taking place in front of billions of people across various platforms. And while we hear about some of the more tragic and traumatic cases, I mean, you could go into a school right now and survey them, and I think you would be surprised at the frequency of how many students in that school have either heard about or have been directly affected by some form of bullying or cyberbullying.
I'm sure you must hear this. I never thought it could happen to my kid, or my kid's the well-adjusted kid. How could this be happening? How could I not know about it? So often, there are no favorites that are played in the cyber world, and more than that, sometimes the parents are the last to know, right?
That's absolutely right. In fact, a lot of times I hear from parents, well, my kid teaches me how to use technology. My kid set this up for me. And not all kids are going to tell their parents everything. They're going to tell them what they want them to know. And usually, to your point, a parent won't find out about the newest app or the newest website or the newest cruel tactic, if you will, that's taking place until after it happens, right? They read about a tragedy, they read about a new trend, they hear about some new app or website based on something that happened in the school and the police are there or somebody's expelled. But it always seems that a lot of times they're learning it after the fact.
You see a tragedy like this, and you see the perpetrators being two other teenage who did this. The parents seemed invested in the case of the girl who died. They seemed to not just be sitting back on their hands, they reached out to the schools and so much else. I think sometimes, unfortunately, culpability is the only thing that will work here, and there's a lot of different actors to go after. Obviously, the perpetrators, we're talking about minors. But what about the schools? What about the service providers that create the platforms for this? And what about the parents of the kids? I mean, you've dealt with this. This isn't theoretical to you. You've dealt with the realities of it. Where do you think the buck ought to stop?
Yeah, well, I think first it has to start. The parents who are handing their kids that technology, they need to be handing that child with technology information, or, you know, in my world, I always pass along the guideline of, are you okay with what you're about to do becoming public and permanent? I know we'll get into that. But then beyond that, you know, I don't see why technology companies wouldn't put out a guideline, something along the lines of, you know, what you are about to do with this device could instantly be public and permanent. You know, we see with the Surgeon General's warnings on a lot of tobacco products, well, how many people had to get hurt first before those guidelines went onto that packaging? And if you look at the first of any situation, any society, any group of people in a new situation, usually there are people that have to get hurt first before we learn from it and we start giving that information.
Last question.
Sure.
Part of what I want to do is scare some parents out there who said, not me, not my kid. If you can do one story protecting identities here of a story that fits the description of a kid that nobody ever would have thought would have been in the spot that he or she was in, what would it be?
I will tell you a true story that came out of Wisconsin. The mother told me this, and it kind of brings in a little of everything that we've talked about since I've been on this panel. It's important that I preface that I'm not saying that kids shouldn't be using digital tools or in gaming, because to try and keep them from that would be, I mean, they need to use these tools, but they need to know how to use them responsibly. And before we hand the keys to the car, or we have, our kids around heat or fire, we give them guidelines. And so it's important that I'm not trying to scare people from using technology, but what I am trying to do is illustrate how scary the consequences of abusing technology can be. This is a true story out of Madison, Wisconsin. Now, there is press on this, but this comes right from the victim, and sometimes there's disparity, and I will not use names. Mother of a 15-year-old is telling me that her son plays World of Warcraft online. He plays with his best friend, and they play with 3 other kids in the school. They all know each other. They play with a 6th person who's 15, 16, but they don't know who that person is offline. They just know them through the game, and they've built up a camaraderie. And all of a sudden, it goes beyond the camaraderie in the game to sharing information, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Fast forward, however much time, and all of a sudden the sixth person's like, hey, I'm going to share some power with you guys. Want to take some power? We'll share it together. And so, yes, I guess they took it. Well, all of a sudden, the person reveals they're not a kid, they're a grown-up, they're an adult, and he feels because he shared the power, he wants a nude photo from every one of these kids. Now, 3 of the kids who were frightened by the threats that they were receiving didn't feel like they could turn to anyone, so they just sent the photo, a nude photo, to a complete stranger in hopes that it would stop the threats. But 2 didn't. The 2 that didn't was the son of the mother telling me this story and his best friend. His best friend's mom gets a knock at the door, pretending to be an undercover agent. Now, she realizes right off the bat, her intuition's kicking in, something's not right here, small town in Wisconsin. So she says tonight, can I see some identification? Well, instead of showing identification, he pulls out a gun. Now, she manages to close the door and call 911, and they catch him. When they catch him, they find guns, tasers, ropes, a number of horrible things. And from what I understand, or the way I understand it, when they investigate his house, he comes from Worcester, Massachusetts. When they investigate his house, they find 2 ditches in his backyard. And he basically admits that he traveled from Worcester, Massachusetts to Madison to murder these 2 15-year-olds because they never provided payment in the form of a nude photo for the power that he delivered. Now, what's important to keep in mind here, and that's one of the most terrific things I've ever heard.
Okay.
If every one of those kids treated him as a complete stranger, as a stranger in the arcade or in the local mall, and they never shared personal information, and they never take anything from a complete stranger, then the odds or the risks go down tremendously. It's no different, really, than talking to a stranger in the mall or in the local arcade, because we're talking about one person they're interacting here. But the minute they gave him leverage by taking something, and again, offline, if I had asked every one of those kids offline, would you go to the local stranger in the local park and tell them where you live, where you go to school? Would you take a brown bag from them? Every one of those kids probably would have said no, right? It's common sense. But in the digital world, it's very different. And so we have to be very guarded to understand through a window to the world. Doesn't matter how big or small your screen. You can't think about 200, or 2,000 people on the other end. You have instant knowledge because there are billions of people on the other side. So are you okay with what you're about to post there, kind or not so kind, being seen by billions of people, not 1 or 2 that you're trying to focus on?
Well, hopefully, parents and even some people in this vulnerable age group here took a few notes here. I got to tell you, this is probably one of the scariest things I think as a parent you got to navigate here, giving this tool, but then all the things that come along with it. Richard, as always, you're fantastic.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the privilege.
Okay, everybody, when we come back here, we are going to bring in our round table. We're going to be talking about what you just heard and about so much more. Stay with us.